Strange Scenes and Eerie Events. Every day, weird things happen for which there are no rational explanations. Take, for example, the case of Retch Sweeney's watch. Retch and I were trolling on a lake in Canada several years ago, and as he leaned over the side of the boat to net a nice rainbow trout I was bringing in, Retch's watch came loose from his wrist and fell into the lake. Not only was the watch expensive, but it held great sentimental value. Retch's wife had given it to him on their 20th anniversary. It bore the inscription, "To Charlie Bomby, for 40 years dedicated service to Acme Sand and Gravel Company." Retch's wife is a great one for sentiment. 5 years after Retch lost his watch in the Canadian lake, he and I went on a boat camping trip on a lake in Montana. It is important to note that there is no waterway connecting the two lakes. After making camp, Retch and I went out to see if we couldn't hook into one of the monster rainbows reported in the vicinity. Sure enough, as we trolled past the mouth of the stream, Retch's rod whipped double, and a few seconds later a beautiful rainbow was doing aerial gymnastics. We went back to camp, and while I started preparing supper, Retch dressed out as fish. Suddenly, he let out a great yell. I rushed over to see what had happened. "Look what I found in this rainbow," he shouted, holding up a shiny object. "I can scarcely believe my eyes," I said. "How could such a thing happen?" "Beats me," Retch said. "I never even heard of anybody finding a bottle cap in the stomach of a fish before." "Me either," I said. "Now, if it had been the watch you lost in the lake up in Canada, I could understand that. You read in the newspapers all the time about that sort of thing happening." Some persons seem to possess almost supernatural powers. One of the ways Retch and I pass the time when the fishing slows down on a lake is to toss a floating ring well out from the boat and then hold casting contests to see who can hit the ring most often. Fred Dokes happened to be along with us one time, and he couldn't miss the ring. Retch and I were impressed. "All right, now I'll really show you something," Fred said. "Something that will amaze you." He took from his pocket a wad of stuff that looked like cookie dough and placed a plug of it over each eye. Next, he tied a large bandana over the top of the dough. Finally, he took off his jacket and tied that around his head in such a way that it was absolutely impossible for him to see out, even if he hadn't had the dough over each eye. "Hand me my rod," he said, standing up in the boat. "Now, what I want you to do is to spin me around 5 times. You don't need to worry about pointing me in the direction of the floating ring." I spun him around 5 times. Naturally, the only thing I expected would happen was that Fred would stagger backwards and fall into the lake. "Okay, just watch this," he said. Fred then took 2 steps backwards and fell into the lake. Of all the people who seemed to have supernatural powers, Fred proved that he wasn't one of them. When he offered to show us how he could shoot skeet blindfolded, we declined on the grounds that watching too many demonstrations of extrasensory perception can bring on a nervous condition. Even weirder was what happened to Retch and me up in the Hoodoo Valley. We'd spent the day fishing on a remote lake and had so much fun that it was practically dark before we knew it. Then the wind came up, and big black clouds came rolling over the mountains, and the sky was cobwebbed with lightning. We got the boat loaded and headed off down the winding 2-lane highway. Even in the daylight, this highway is spooky, but on a dark and stormy night it can really give you the creeps. Mist hangs in tattered shrouds over the swampy land. Ancient, moss-draped trees line the road, their branches moaning in the wind, and from time to time dark, shaggy shapes scurry through the beams of the headlights. Rain began to splatter the windshield before we had driven a mile. Then we saw him. Standing alongside the road up ahead was a slender, pale youth with long, streaming hair, his thumb beckoning us to stop. "I've heard this one before," Retch said. "Don't stop for him." "We just can't let the poor devil stand out there in the rain. He'll drown," I said. "The way the story goes," Retch said, "is that he has already. But before he could finish, I'd brought the car to a stop, and the youth was crawling into the back seat. He appeared to be about 18, with pale eyes, pale lips, and pale hair. We drove along in silence for some time, Retch tensely popping his knuckles and occasionally reaching back to pat down the hairs that persisted in rising on the back of his neck. Finally, I tried to strike up a bit of conversation with the lad. "You from these parts?" I asked. The boy said nothing. "What were you doing out in a storm like this?" My question was only answered by an eerie silence. "Oh, my gosh," Retch muttered under his breath. "I knew it. Next he's going to tell us the bridge up ahead is washed out." "Don't be silly," I whispered. "The bridge up ahead is washed out," the boy said. "You'd better take the river road to town." I patted down a few unruly hairs on the back of my neck. "Right." When we reached the intersection of the river road, I stopped the car and climbed out to take a close look and make sure the road was impassable. Retch scrambled out of the car with me. "You were crazy to pick that kid up," he hissed at me. "I know he's the same one I heard about somewhere. I'm walking the rest of the way to town." Just then a high, wavering cry drifted out of the darkness up ahead. "One thing's for sure," Retch said. "I'm not walking to town." When we got back to the car, the pale youth was gone. We two pale, middle-aged men scrambled into the car, which spewed out twin rooster tails of mud over the boat and trailer as we shot off down the river road. We slid to a stop in front of the only bar in the town and bounded inside, both of us having the distinct impression that we were being trailed, possibly by a large bat. The barmaid and a scattering of patrons gave us curious stares. "You look like you seen a ghost," the barmaid said. Two double shots of the strongest stuff you've got," Retch ordered. "I don't know what he's having." The same," I said. We then related our story to the folks in the bar. They listened with attentive solemnness, occasionally nodding as if to say, "Yes, yes, yes." They knew what had happened. When we had finished, an old white-bearded fellow took off his rimless spectacles and wiped them. "I reckon you fellas have just become acquainted with the Jakes boy. He drove his car into the river a couple of years back." Drove his car into the river?" Retch said. Drowned?" I said. "Drowned?" the old man said. "Heck no, he didn't drown. But driving his car into the river is apparently what give him the idea of thumbing rides on dark and stormy nights and scaring the bejeebers out of fishermen like you fellas." At that, the regulars at the bar burst into hysterical laughter and slapped their knees black and blue and rolled around on the floor, and generally gave the impression of being highly amused. As Retch and I slunk for the door, the old man spoke again, and the mirthful occupants of the room instantly suspended their hilarity. "There is one thing, though, that's a little strange about your experience. I'm kind of surprised you didn't notice it." "What's that?" I asked. "There ain't no bridge on the highway up to the lake." Retch and I stomped out of the bar. If there's one thing I hate, it's a bunch of drunken yokels making a spectacle of themselves. When we got to the car, I stared into the back seat where the Jakes boy had been sitting. "Wait a second," I said. "If that wasn't a ghost, why isn't the seat wet where he was sitting?" Retch looked into the back seat. "You've got a point there," he said. "On the other hand, why would a ghost steal both our tackle boxes?" The mystery was never solved, even though Retch and I spent a couple of dark and stormy nights driving up and down the highway, hoping to give a lift to a lad with pale eyes, pale lips, pale hair, and two dark green tackle boxes that didn't belong to him.